My name is Winston C. Thompson. I'm an associate professor of educational studies and associate professor of philosophy by courtesy here at The Ohio State University. I am also a member of the steering committee for the Center for Ethics and Human Values, and it's through that work that I am coordinating this year's COMPAS series. As you all know, or at least many of you know, COMPAS is one of the sort of signature series of the Center for Ethics and Human Values. COMPAS, or Conversations on Morality, Politics, and Society, is a series that focuses our attention on issues that deserve normative and ethical consideration as we think about what it is to live with others in our social context. This year, so every year there is a theme for the COMPAS series. This year's theme is especially meaningful as our theme this year, COMPAS Directions, allows us to celebrate a decade of ethical inquiry. So over the past 10 iterations of this program, we've explored a number of meaningful and influential themes, and we are now turning our attention or returning our attention to these themes as we're hosting a series of events this year focusing attention on those past themes. One might be sort of inclined to think that, well, we've talked about these themes, right? We've settled these issues. There's nothing left to discuss. Why continue the conversation? Well, it is our view that these themes are timely and timeless. It's the case that by returning to these themes, we're able to explore dimensions of them that continue to animate conversation in the present moment. And the theme from 2013, 2014 is no different. That year's theme saw the center focusing in on distinctions between and coherence between the concepts of private and public. And so today we are excited to return attention to the public-private distinction, if there is a distinction to be made there, as we turn our attention to identities. How public and or private should they be? Now, before I introduce today's moderator, I do want to say something about our format. For those of you who have attended our events in the past, this will not be extremely new to you, but we will first hear from our invited guests. They'll each have a period of time to share some remarks with you. Then we'll have a bit of a conversation up here at the front of the room as you're digesting what's been said and thinking about your own contributions. We'll then move to having questions from the audience, as your voice is an essential part of our ongoing conversation. I just want to identify that there's a microphone just over there, so when we get to the QA portion of today's event, I ask that folks queue at the microphone to pose their questions. Okay, so without further delay, please allow me to introduce our moderator, my OSU colleague, Dr. Aaron Moore. Dr. Moore is the Dr. Carl F. Asif Assistant Professor in Anthropology and the History of Medicine. Dr. Moore is a social cultural and medical anthropologist. Dr. Moore's research brings critical humanist perspectives to the study of global health, disease, and development. Geographically, Dr. Moore specializes in sub-Saharan Africa and in globally mobile NGO bureaucracies. And Dr. Moore is currently investigating the gendered political economic history of Uganda's devastating HIV epidemic, and has previously written about East African miniskirt bans, development interventions targeting adolescent girls, love and deception in the sexual economy, and translating global feminisms. I'm sure that you'll agree that Dr. Moore is the perfect moderator for today's event. So please join me in thanking Dr. Moore.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and especially to Winston Thompson for organizing the event. So as Dr. Thompson was saying, in my own research, I've long been interested in the ways that gender conservatism and homophobia have become hegemonic, both in Uganda but around the globe. And particularly in Uganda, how gender conservatism and homophobia shape both public life and politics there. But also as a citizen of Ohio now for 4 years, I also find this an extremely urgent time as a citizen for the conversation that we're about to have. So, as I'm sure that everyone in the room is aware, in April of this year, a bill banning gender-affirming healthcare for trans young people and banning trans youth from participating in girls' athletics is set to become law after the governor vetoed it and then the House overrode the veto. And in fact, in most parts of Ohio, it's still legal to discriminate against LGBTQ plus people. A bill introduced to the Ohio Senate in September of 2023, the Ohio Fairness Act, would expand Ohio's current protections against discrimination based on sex to sexual orientation and gender expression, but it's a bill that's been introduced, it's not a law, so the illegality is still there. And so I just want to flag that local context to ground us here, and I want us to keep it in mind as we hear from our speakers. And I'm so excited to introduce our first guest, Robin Dembroff. Robin Dembroff is an assistant professor in the philosophy department at Yale University. Dembroff works on feminist and LGBTQ philosophy with a focus on what gender is and how it shapes social outcomes, experiences, and ways of knowing. Their current book project is titled Real Men on Top: How Patriarchy Weaponizes Gender. Dembroff's other work has been published in professional journals spanning 4 disciplines and appears in popular venues, including Scientific American, the Boston Review, Time, The Guardian, and the New York Review of Books. In 2019, Dembroff co-authored an amicus brief in support of gay and transgender employees, which was submitted to the United States Supreme Court on behalf of over 70 philosophy professors. And in 2022, Britannica named Dembroff one of 20 shapers of the future under 40 in academia and ideas. So please join me in welcoming Robin Dembroff.
First, I want to say thank you so much for having me here today and for the invitation. It's really fun for me and gratifying to do events that are not just giving kind of like philosophy talks to a philosophy department. It's an opportunity for me to really step back and think at a bigger picture. And my first plan for what I was going to say today, and probably for those of you who are familiar with my scholarly work might have been expecting, was something more like an analytic picture of social identity as a way to kick things off. If I had gone down that path, I would have been doing something like sketching an abstract conceptual scaffolding of social identity that would have hopefully applied to basically any social identity, from things like Buckeye or Goth to much more gravitational kind of social identities like Christian or Palestinian. But every time I wrote a draft trying to do that, I couldn't shake this feeling that if I went down that path, I would be somehow misunderstanding the moment. And so I ended up throwing a lot of drafts away. My plan totally changed directions when I picked up a letter that James Baldwin wrote in 1962 to his nephew, who is also named James. I saw, as I read his letter, that Baldwin was expressing many of the same ideas that I had been trying, much less successfully, to express. And his articulation was so much more successful because it possessed the flesh of feeling. His words were situated within the intimate context of a letter, but they pointed to a much more general picture of the relationship between self and social identity. They also, I think, highlighted what is at stake in the struggle to create identities that facilitate recognition, both of ourselves and each other, rather than alienation from ourselves and from each other. And so I decided to spend my remarks today telling you a little bit about this letter and how I understand its lessons. Baldwin's letter begins with a piece of family history that paints a stark picture of existential risks of being Black in white America. He tells James that his grandfather, Baldwin's father, had a terrible life. In the same sentence, Baldwin goes on to elaborate what he means by this. He does not say what someone might expect. He doesn't talk, for example, about poverty or police brutality or incarceration or disease or the kinds of things that I think we're often prone to associate with a quote-unquote terrible life. My father had a terrible life, Baldwin writes. He was defeated long before he died because at the bottom of his heart, he really believed what white people said about him. There is nothing in Baldwin's tone that suggests that he holds his father accountable for this quote-unquote defeat. He doesn't blame his father for having internalized the image that was reflected back by the white world. Baldwin's description serves instead to warn his nephew that losing sight of the value of his own life is the deepest form of destruction, and to remind him that American society has been built across centuries to continually message the worthlessness of Black life. Quote, "The details and symbols of your life have been deliberately constructed to make you believe what white people say about you." Through the story of his father, Baldwin illustrates the larger truth that private identity is always already enmeshed with public identity. We learn who we are from the people around us. And we know this from developmental psychology. From around 18 months old, we start to ask the question, who am I? And we look to other people for the answer to this question. I think this is the deepest form of trust. And it's important to note that we are predisposed as human beings to trust each other in this way. We learn to interpret ourselves through how other people interpret us. And so given this, I think it's an enormous ask when Baldwin continues in his letter to James, please try to remember that what they believe, as well as what they do and cause you to endure, does not testify to your inferiority, but to their inhumanity and fear. When I read this, I thought, how is James supposed to do this? How is he supposed to just wall off his self-identity from the degraded identity that is constantly being conferred onto him? As Baldwin himself acknowledges, James was, quote, born into a society which spelled out with brutal cruelty and is in as many ways as possible that he is a worthless human being. Against this tsunami of social messaging and social interpretation, how is James supposed to hold on to a vision of himself that has not been gutted of its value? Faced with this fundamental question of identity, Baldwin does not follow in what are to some of us the familiar footsteps of the white philosophical canon. He does not advise James, for example, to perform a Cartesian cogito. He doesn't advise James to follow John Locke in speculating whether he would persist through a memory lapse. He doesn't question whether following David Hume were all just bundles of perceptions. And he certainly doesn't muse with Bertrand Russell whether we exist at all. This post-Enlightenment tradition of philosophers doubting whether our lives have any meaning has generated many clever puzzles and still more clever solutions. But as Rabbi Abraham Heschel wrote, the business of doubt is one of auditing the mind's accounts of reality rather than a concern with reality itself. Baldwin is confronted by a society that aims to strip his nephew, like his father before him, of his ability to value himself. He has no time to leisure in interrogating his mind's account of reality. His letter instructs James to find alternative grounds for his identity, to build a foundation that exists apart from the symbols and details of the white world. He tells him how, too. Quote, "Trust your experience and know whence you came." What I hear when I read these words, to trust your experience and know whence you came, is the idea that when we know what we feel and we understand why we feel it, we gain a reliable mirror to see ourselves and our value more clearly. There is a reason why abusers, whether in the home or in seats of political power, fear both sensuality and history. People are much harder to manipulate when they know what they feel and they understand why they feel it. Notice, too, that Baldwin doesn't just tell James, don't listen to what white people say about you. Negation is not enough. We all have and we all need self-identities. We all share a basic human need to interpret ourselves, to make sense of ourselves to ourselves. Now, I know I'm flirting here with great abstraction again, But I believe that it's in that process of relating to ourselves that we grow and we expand and we become present in our choices. The Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard, in fact, describes this process of self-relating as the very constitution of what it is to have a self at all. The self, he says, is the relation of the self to itself. To be human is to be in the process of self-interpretation. I think Baldwin knows that unless James has some alternative lens for self-interpretation, the degrading lens of white America will fill that void. He doesn't dictate an alternative lens to James. In fact, he tells James to take no one's word, even his own, for that. Instead, Baldwin offers James this combination of self-awareness and historical understanding as a recipe that will allow James to construct an alternative lens for himself. Know what you feel and why you feel it, and it gets a lot easier to resist distorted messages about who you are. Baldwin's letter doesn't end there. He actually goes on and flips this script of identity. Up until this point, Baldwin has been advising James on how to understand himself. But in the last part of his letter, he turns to offer James an understanding of white Americans. He doesn't mince words about the gravity of their actions. Quote, "The crime of which I accuse my country and my countrymen, and for which neither I nor history will ever forgive them," he writes, "is that they have destroyed and are destroying hundreds of thousands of lives and do not know it and do not want to know it." His emphasis here is on the theme of denial. Most white Americans, he says, are still trapped in a history which they do not understand. And not understanding their history, they do not understand themselves. The American racial order and their place as white people within it becomes to them the, quote, order of nature, a fundamental premise of their reality. Now, Baldwin doesn't explicitly describe to James what history he has in mind here, but he well knew the social history of America. For example, he knew that during the Civil War and Reconstruction, many poor white Americans were educated into white supremacy by elites who stood to profit by stoking racial fear and resentment. And so perhaps this is why he tells James, white people have had to believe for many years and for innumerable reasons that black men are inferior to white men. And the problem now, he says, is that for even those who can see the lie, the danger of acting differently is the loss of their identity. Baldwin closes his letter by urging James to let this historical understanding become a perspective that is tinted by compassion. "The real terrible thing, old buddy," he writes, "is that you must accept them, and accept them with love. With love, we shall force our brothers to see themselves as they are, to cease fleeing from reality and begin to change it. We cannot be free until they are free." To close my own remarks now, I want to speak directly to any queer young people who are in this audience or who end up watching the video of this talk. You are becoming adults in a moment where I think you face an existential challenge that is not dissimilar than the one Baldwin describes in his letter. Baldwin, who was gay, knew this challenge as well. The value of your lives, like Black lives and disabled lives and refugee lives and Palestinian lives, are a topic of public debate. Your state legislature here in Ohio and many of your neighbors have doubled down on a lens that interprets you back to yourself as disgusting, sinful, delusional, or narcissistic. I believe that the biggest danger to you right now is believing what they say about you. Remember that their rage is not about you. Their rage stems from an existential fear, the fear of losing their identity. They have had to believe for many years, and for innumerable reasons, that who they fundamentally are as human beings, an identity that they understand to dictate the very shape of their life, how they should look, how they should feel, how they should think, how they should act, was forever fixed by their genital size at birth. Think about that. I think it's sad. I think it's sad that people are indoctrinated to submit their lives without question to this myth of identity. And I think it's even sadder and entirely predictable that those who are desperate to maintain this myth feel compelled to denigrate those who refuse it. I know that things feel scary right now and that the future seems very uncertain. I myself find comfort in the words of poet Adrienne Marie Brown, who says, "Things are not getting worse, they're getting uncovered. We must hold each other tight and continue to pull back the veil." As you go on to face this uncertain future, I ask that you try your best to know your experience and to know your history, our history. Try as best you can to accept with love those people who are captive to a reality where their identity rests on your denigration. It will be hard, and some days it will be impossible. But if there is one thing that we learn from Baldwin's letter to James, it is that this messy attempt to achieve and reveal and confirm a human identity is the only hope for our country and neighbors and ourselves. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Robin. Now let me introduce Joseph J. Sosa, an anthropologist and queer studies scholar. His research and teaching focus on gender and sexuality politics in the Americas, with an emphasis on the connections between state policy, public culture, and activism. His book, which is coming out in November, Brazil's Sex Wars, The Aesthetics of Queer Activism in Sao Paulo, examines how sexual human rights cultures transformed over Brazil's turbulent decade in the 2010s. Sosa is also currently researching the history of U.S. butyl nitrate, or nitrite, poppers, the poppers industry, examining how poppers enabled new erotic orientations and played key roles in the sexual revolution, gay power, the early AIDS crisis, and contemporary queer pop culture. Sosa is the former co-chair for the Association of Queer Anthropology, and his research has been funded by the National Science Foundation, Fulbright, the Mellon Foundation, the Wenner-Gren Foundation, and the Ford Foundation. Please join me in welcoming Joseph J. Sosa.
Hi, thank you so much. Gonna see if we can. Okay, I brought slides because I like to share. So my comments today take inspiration from Eve Sedgwick's 1990 book, The Epistemology of the Closet, a book whose subject matter revolves around the dissimulating effects that public disclosures of identity generate. Specifically, I focus on, see if we can, okay, there we go. Specifically, I focus on the seventh and final axiom to Sedgwick's introduction, where she writes, "The paths of allo-identification, or identifying with, are likely to be strange and recalcitrant. So are the paths of auto-identification, or identifying as." What does Sedgwick mean by this? So Sedgwick draws on her scholarly positionality as a woman who wrote primarily about gay male desire and literary fiction, as well as her classroom experience teaching pioneering courses on gay and lesbian studies while negotiating tensions between men and women attending the seminar. That is, through her scholarship and her pedagogy, Sedgwick begins with the epistemological and ethical problematic most conventionally associated with identity-based politics. How does one speak to lived experiences that are not one's own? Yet, Sedgwick ultimately lands in an unexpected place, with what she describes as a much more intimate dissonance in her seminar. She writes, "It appeared that each woman in the class possessed an ability to make one or more of the other women radically and excruciatingly doubt the authority of her own self-definition as a woman, as a feminist, and as a positional subject of a particular sexuality. To this unease, Sedgwick hypothesizes that to identify as must always include multiple processes of identifying with, processes that for Sedgwick she viewed as fraught with intensities of incorporation, diminishment, inflation, threat, loss, reparation, and disavowal. Identities, whether they come from socially marginalized or privileged experiences, are also extremely intimate. At the same time, they require shared vocabularies over which any one person has only partial control. So Sedgwick reminds us that to cede to others the labels that define ourselves itself produces anxieties. So I work with these anxieties of identifying with and identifying as in my role as a teacher and researcher in a gender, sexuality, and women's studies program. These interdisciplinary academic programs, like critical ethnic studies, feminist, queer, and trans studies, disability studies, are possible because of the intellectual and pedagogical experiments like the ones that Sedgwick recounts. Such interdisciplinary programs are also the result of historic shifts in political subjectivity through which the concept of identity and the practice of identifying has become socially legible in the past 70 years. As literary scholar Liram Medavoy details, our contemporary concept of identity was popularized in the United States in the post-World War II era, not through minority mobilization, but rather through Cold War psychology. As it emerged in the psychology of youth culture, think like Erik Erikson, the concept of identity established a new vocabulary for describing the self, one that elevated what Medavoy describes as a psychopolitical autonomy in the struggle against the state role expectations in an increasingly authoritarian world. It was this meta-narrative that racial minority, women's, and gay social movements adopted in the 1960s and 1970s as taking on an identity entailed becoming new subjects of historical struggle. So within the academy, interdisciplinary studies became a home for the conceptual practice-based elaboration of this new identity-based political subject. Occasioned by the demands of student activists meeting the institutionalizing norms of colleges and universities, beginning in the late 60s and through the 70s, interdisciplinary studies prompted what Roderick Ferguson describes as a new era of biopower. The traditional disciplines of the human sciences, so sociology, anthropology, economics, and political science, dealt with the productive and reproductive capacities of an imagined universal human body to measure populational effects. By contrast, these new interdisciplinary knowledges challenged the universality of the human condition that, oh, this is just off. Oh yeah, no, I just put some spacers, but thank you. And they're probably timed all wrong too. By contrast, new interdisciplinary knowledges challenged the universality of the human condition and kind of preceded a new way to kind of think about knowledge and power in the academy. Within this contemporary landscape, identity was both a marker of difference from the universal and a diagnostic tool to elaborate systems of power previously under-theorized, such as white supremacy, patriarchy, heteronormativity, ableism, etc. So this detour through our historical present is helpful because, I hope, because it attunes us not only to the question of what identity is, but what I would contend is the more important question, what identity does. To address this second question, let me begin close to home with the introduction to Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies course that I teach every fall. This course fills primarily two purposes. It's both an introduction to the interdisciplinary field, and it also services our difference, power, and inequity general education requirement. I'm sure we can think of what those are called in our own institutions. So we have to understand this course institutionally as both training students in a critical tradition and also disciplining students to understand themselves as certain kinds of subjects. So in this course, I present my vision of the field. Students begin by using identity as a heuristic that helps them connect their personal experiences, be they experiences of marginalization or privilege, to operations of power and regimes of structural oppression. So this is the definition of identity that I give students, and I want to say a little bit about how I kind of reached this definition. So each time I ask students to discuss their identities, students, most often with dominant identities, encountered ways to kind of navigate around the ethical and political questions that I hoped that these discussions would encourage. For instance, on my jock-heavy campus, students often describe their identities as members of sports teams. This led me to offer students the following definition for identity in our learning space. And by kind of asking them to think about their identities as not just a label, but rather a label that connects their experiences to questions of power, I'm I hope that we're kind of like working to think about what identity does in terms of helping us unpack those modes of power collectively. So how could I engage students to think about power relations inherent in the contemporary concept of identity without imposing predetermined ideologies around race, gender, and sexuality? So I was inspired by artist Paul Ramirez Jonas's 2017 performance installation, Fake IDs. As part of the performance, visitors turned over the contents of their wallets, like credit cards, licenses, work or student IDs, or even consumer loyalty punch cards. It's hard to imagine even now, like 5 years later, probably a lot of this is digital. At the New Museum in New York, the exhibit was staffed by teen interns who used photocopy and plastification to issue individuals, oh no, this is still the same slide, new hybrid identification cards. And then extra materials, such as unused photographs or isolated city names, were kept and turned into a secondary work showing the collective identifying markers of visitors who participate in the piece. So technically, fake ID does not address the interpersonal tensions of identifying as or with. Instead, it focuses on the identification as a mechanism of state and economic control. But if we approach fake ID primarily as method, we can think about the general tensions of this kind of identifying collectively and individually. Participants in fake ID must hand over documents as semiotic shreds of how state, commercial, and nonprofit institutions see them. In return, participants are handed back a patchwork artifact that has the unsettling effect of being a parodic representation of themselves. So presenting this work in class, I asked students to consider how fake IDs demonstrates the bits of identity that each of us perpetually circulate and remediate in daily encounters. In a related assignment, students take parts of their lived experiences and refashion them as part of a new ID. And so here's a student example that I was with some identity markers kind of taken out. And of course, my student is under 21, so it's a vertical ID card. So given the opportunity to manufacture their own identification cards, students think about all of the kinds of identities that might not fit within our everyday rubrics of how to identify. So in different iterations, people have included their zip code, unmarked heritages, or erotic dispositions as indices of power relations. They find ways to express dynamic or ambiguous representations of identities. So for instance, in this example, we see question marks, crossed out categories, etc. Other students have presented identity cards that show how they're seen in their home communities versus how they're seen on campus. By playing with conventional forms through which individuals are asked about their identities, students explore the complexities of how they fit into the world beyond the circumscribed set of labels normally offered to them. So my second example today comes from the LGBT plus social movement activism in Sao Paulo, Brazil, where I conducted ethnographic fieldwork from 2011 to 2013. Unsurprisingly, identity played a major role in how activists cast themselves as minoritized citizens and subjects of human rights. The tension of how lesbian, gay, and bisexual and trans activists came together within LGBT movement organization was, of course, a major concern. In everyday discourse within social movement spaces, for instance, travestis were often the individuals named as the most radical and most vulnerable members of the LGBT community, yet they were often missing from LGBT movement spaces. So travesti is the name adopted by Brazilian trans femme individuals who have a unique history of body modification and subjectivity. They remained a point of fascination and attempted solidarity by cisgender and gay and lesbian activists. At one protest, for instance, a gay man with the bullhorn declared that while gays get beaten up in downtown Sao Paulo, the travesti over there on the corner in the urban periphery suffers 10 times greater violence. Of course, this imagination around the radical embodiment and severe oppression was made possible by the fact that travestis were rarely present at protests to describe their own experiences. Social movement schedules fit the rhythms of university students and office workers and even service workers who organize their time away from the work in their early evenings and on weekends. Travestis were often overrepresented in sex work and nightclub entertainment industries, and their daily rhythms ran counter to those of social movements. So it was in this context that I first heard the chant, E daí, eu também sou travesti. And so what? I'm also travesti, at a street protest in Sao Paulo. This rhetorical identification was motivated by the belief that, as I heard kind of in various ways, this time by a lesbian civil service worker casually explaining to her coworkers that travestis were the most radical people of all. Sometimes travestis embrace this radical subject position. So travesti punk icon Claudia Wonder said in her biographical documentary, "For me, there is no travesti who is neither man nor woman. On the contrary, honey, I'm a man, I am a woman." At other times, travestis warned of the limits of this cultural fascination. As another activist explained on a speaker's panel, travestis used to be known for their glamour, but now they're known only for their marginality. Like the remediations of identity in the fake ID performance piece, the protest chant probably drew on several popular cultural inspirations. So, in a short essay titled "Am I Not Also Travesti?", a gay man and cultural theorist Denilson Lopez describes his own visceral fascination with gender variance in Brazil that expressed itself through gay male diva worship. Lopez confesses, "I have always been fascinated but never attracted to travestis in the same proportion that I have always been attracted to but never fascinated by muscular men." The "so what" of the chant may come from a 2005 interview where pop singer Ana Carolina came out in the weekly magazine Veja saying, "Sou bi e daí? I'm bi, so what?" Underneath Ana Carolina's quote, the magazine described her as an icon for a generation that doesn't care about sexual labels and doesn't turn them into social causes. Of course, here protesters decried this "so what" to signify exactly the opposite of what Ana Carolina had originally conveyed. So how to think about this protest chant as a political claim, as a troubled political claim? In a recorded interview that I conducted with one interlocutor whom I call Yara, I asked her perspective on this protest chant. Yara was one of the few travesti activists who regularly participated in the larger LGBT social movement events, and her exceptional status might have been due to the fact that she had finished her bachelor's degree and had become an outreach worker for a non-governmental organization. Had kind of been able to participate in economic advancement that had been largely shut out to other travestis. I'm going to just quickly reproduce kind of her longer interview that kind of different parts of it have been cut out. Rather than kind of read this all to you, what I'd like to kind of convey from this conversation was that in the beginning of our conversation, Yara started by saying it would depend on the context in which people kind of selected this chant. She said she saw it as something like solidarity, that kind of, you know, using travesti as a marker of something that's desirable already kind of goes against society. By the end of the conversation, she said something that stuck out to me, and what I kind of want to focus on, and that she said that, well, for me, it makes no sense to shout, "I am also travesti. I am just travesti. There is no also." So in a longer version of this vignette, we might kind of interpret Yada's distinction between "I am" and "I am also" as the subjective grounds for cisgender appropriation of travesti identity. We could explore the conventional tension of identifying against. And I do that in other places. Following IATA's lead to generously interpret the chant as an attempt at solidarity, I wonder if new questions emerge when we ask how this chant is also an example of identifying with. As IATA points out, her initial act is to identify not against cisgendered people versus travesti, but rather to identify as a militante or a social movement activist. Within Sao Paulo's LGBT social movement, identifying as a militante was not a given, but often involved an act of consciousness raising after experiencing an act of discrimination. Most of the identities we conventionally imagine are what sociologists would describe as ascribed identities. That is, identities that are often assigned to people and only kind of recognized as different with kind of great effort. On the contrast, activism might be called an achieved identity. That is kind of an identity that one does through that one accomplishes through specific actions. And in this case, it involved militantes directly positioning themselves as a certain kind of citizen against the state. So Yara was by no means apologizing for activists who shouted this chant. Yet her careful considerations show how identifying is a process, a process that often means wading through ethically, politically, and interpersonally troubled waters. So today I moved somewhat around the question of whether identity should be public or private, and I'm excited to kind of get to that conversation because instead I endeavored to show how the interdisciplinary studies, such as critical ethnic studies, feminist and queer studies, teaches us that identity cannot help but being experienced as highly personal while still being collectively determined. And these tensions between the labels with which we come to describe ourselves and the inevitable social groups that emerge around these labels produce challenges for living with others, whether those challenges are based on conflicts of difference or conflicts of similitude. On the whole, these conflicts cut across the question of privacy and publicity because identity is never about the label itself, but rather the lived social relations that give those identities meaning. At least that's what I've learned about what identity does through teaching it in the classroom and studying it in fieldwork. And finally, I just would kind of remark this kind of like in a side note, that this talk has also made several returns to pedagogy and activism, where the processes of identifying as and identifying with often appear most explicitly. This reflects historically how pedagogy and activism have been key sites of subject formation where what it means to have an identity has been honed, elaborated, and publicized. So considering the tensions of identifying as and with, however, challenge some of the caricatures that particularly we might imagine on perhaps the political right, the caricature that such spaces have as promoting a monolithic ideology around identity. I would propose, however, that those spaces and spaces like these are sites of experimentation for how to live together. So anticipating what you were saying. So thank you so much. Thanks.
Okay. And thank you, Robin. Both of those talks were, they were amazing and they were very moving. They gave us so much to think with, but also to feel with, which, Robin, as you were saying, seems like a private practice, but has public implications, right? And so I wanted to start our discussion today by asking both of you to expand on what you were saying in both of your conclusions in different ways, and to offer us in the room advice for how to move forward, given the current political context that we've been describing and your insights. And, I think this question of how to move forward can take a lot of different shapes, right? But as scholars, as people, as students. So we could start there, whoever wants to.
Do you want to go first? I can say some things. So first of all, I want to just remark that I'm 33 years old. Like, I haven't lived through a lot of the, like, when I talk to people who are my grandparents' age and the things that they have lived through, I feel like they have wisdom of having lived through things like what we're experiencing that I am trying to achieve, but I want to also just acknowledge the limitations of my own experience in trying to be so audacious as to answer this question, because it's a big question of, like, how do we survive an environment that is being created to be not survivable? I do think, like, when I think about the advice that, and this is partly why I find so much wisdom in Baldwin, part of what I found so powerful in his letter and other of his writings on the answer to this question is this twofold approach of both the importance of knowing ourselves, of being with ourselves, and also the importance of having the space and having the community to have a perspective on those that are trying to make our environment not survivable. So when I think about, when I think about, like, an interpersonal abusive relationship, and it's kind of like when there's conflict, it's like, how do you survive that? And in an interpersonal relationship, there can be a tendency to go one of two extremes, either to go the route of alienation, just like cutting people off from each other, or the route of codependency, which is either trying to control the other person's narrative or take on the other person's narrative, and a kind of people pleasing. And the thing Baldwin offers us that I gestured to at the end is instead like a third path, which others have called disidentification, which I know we'll get to later, but it's a way of both knowing who you are and getting the space that you need to be able to approach the people that are causing so much conflict and strife in a way that you can see that I am me and you are you, and I don't need to be you or I don't need to be against you. So it provides, like, a different way to navigate conflict. And I think we really need right now in this moment new ways to navigate conflict, because what we're seeing is intense polarization or fear and submission. So we need some kind of third way through to be able to know who we are and still be able to live in the environment.
Well, thank you. And also, what a flex, kind of saying you were only 33. I'm very threatened by that. So, the kind of to the question of, like, the public and private, when we're kind of in kind of, like, the public or private is often kind of a kind of situational experience, right? Like, we are here in this kind of, we're here at a public event, but we're, like, in this enclosed space where we can say things that we might not be able to say in the next room over, or down the street. And so, like to think about, this, like to think about this, our political moment or the political moments that have been past and brought us to here, it can be demobilizing to think about kind of the totality of everything kind of at once. And it might also be, it might also play into the strategies of people who are opposed to an agenda of our kind of collective flourishing. And today I'll say "our" in terms of the people who are in this room, and so to be able to kind of step to find moments of either disidentification or to step aside for a second can be often interpreted as kind of expressions of privilege or as kind of like moments of taking oneself out of the situation. But they can also be moments of building, and they can be be kind of moments of, and they can be things that we don't necessarily kind of just like we kind of do kind of exercise in ways that we don't necessarily see the results immediately. They can be kind of moments of preparation for kind of the times when we're really going to need those skills and those perspectives and vocabularies and relationships and solidarities that we're going to need in kind of like, you know, when the ish really hits the fan. So, you know, yeah, I mean, I think like it's hard to think about kind of moving forward without some form of guilt or some form of kind of thinking about what am I like ignoring when I kind of put my, you know, head forward. But I think, you know, like thinking about those perspectives and why one is engaged in the kind of activity that you're doing when you're when the activity is right in front of you, it can help you kind of get to the next one.
Thank you. I think maybe we should go to the question of disidentification and talk a little bit more about what that looks like and how, you know, folks in the room can practice that and also inspire that in others, right? So Robin, I think your talk through Baldwin, you really helped show, right, that these things that are taken as norms or almost as non-identities, right? So like the white non-identity or the kind of, you know, like the heterosexual non-identity, right? Or that these are norms against which other kinds of identities are formed, right? But there's something about pointing out that people are educated into them, that people are ideologized into them, that I think might, you know, I would just want to hear you speak more to, you know, how to inspire that kind of thinking in the people that suffer from identification with these kinds of projects.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing I'll say is kind of to echo the things that Jay was saying. I think that an important step, and Baldwin highlights this, of disidentifying with those kinds of projects is having an alternative ground to your identity. And I think that creating spaces where you're becoming more in touch with yourself, which I think, you know, more people are starting to realize the importance of, things like meditation, things like having various kinds of spiritual practices, I think finding communities where we can hold each other in those practices. I think that is a really important part of forming identity that allows us to not only step outside of those practices that you're talking about, but also have the standpoint to see not only how they harm us, but how they make us into agents of harm towards other people. So I guess that's the main thing I would say. I think that we really need to build communities where we create communities that are built on practices that are going against those kinds of dominant practices. I mean, one of the things you talked about labels, Jay, I mean, language practices is a huge part of this. Like, I think languages are the things that give flesh to our social identity, and language means what it does, you know? And so creating communities where we're thinking, where we're like thinking about that. How are we using language, for example? I mean, there's many other kinds of practices, but these are the kinds of things I think we can do to just be more intentional and aware of how we are habituated to respond to ourselves and to other people in order to build up identities that can be, as I said at the beginning of the talk, a site of recognition rather than this alienation or codependency.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Jay, do you want to speak to that?
Well, I'll just say also like what I've been hearing from your comments, Robin, has also been that both kind of conflict and care are two are two kind of necessary processes that that communities have to go through. So what you were saying made me kind of think about how, contrary to maybe our conventional understandings of those two, that conflict and care aren't necessarily opposed to one another. That they are, I mean, this is like what we understand with like even just like a practice of like calling in, right? Like of kind of saying like, you know, having a disagreement be an opportunity for education. But just to to not be afraid of those multiple. Those kinds of multiple ways of being in the same space was what kind of struck me from like what you were saying.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think too, you know, something that struck me through both of your talks and this conversation is this, this refusal to accept a conceptualization of identity as something that really can like ever be stabilized. It needs to be affirmed and reaffirmed, but it's always provisional. It's always relational. And, you know, as I think about that, and I think especially, Jay, in your work with activists, I mean, you were saying too, right? So identities are achieved and identities do things in the world. I'm wondering about how you both see this kind of new concept fitting with older social movements that were, or like identity politics, right? There's a whole social and historical moment around this idea that identities just had to be revealed, or, you know, if they were repressed, they had to come out. And that was this very kind of empowering framework for historical social movements. So I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about, this kind of, this newer kind of conceptualization of identity that you're both working with.
Well, I'm reading a new book for a class I'm teaching over break, Ramsey Fawaz's Queer Forms, where they're arguing that actually some of our understandings of what kind of those kinds of 1970s models for identity politics were might be kind of our own historical imagination of kind of thinking about kind of identity-based politics was completely essentializing. Mm-hmm. It was based on kind of discrete categories versus. Is it not? Okay, sorry. I was totally bragging with Erin at the beginning how good I am with microphones too.
You want this one?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you. But so I think. Oh wow. Okay, that does make a difference. Okay, that's fair. But also maybe like our. Maybe kind of like thinking about how that our kind of new take towards fluid identities might not be as new as we kind of imagine them to be, and that opens us up for kind of going back into the archives to talking with elders. I mean, through so many practices of kind of going back and figuring out kind of how kind of past movements have been kind of tools.
Yeah, I've been teaching a lot of the radical feminist movement recently, and within that movement, you see everything from the kind of thing that you're talking about, this like fluidity, to the more essentializing take. And it's always just like a mess of all of it. So on the one hand, you have people, like Janice Raymond, who are doubling down on a kind of essentialist, like, no, we're going to, the real womanhood is going to emerge through our movement. But then you also get, the people who are like Monique Fatigue saying, no, like woman is defined as the being that's sexually available to men. So like lesbians aren't even women. Other people who want to change it to women with a Y in order to mark the shifting of identity into a new thing. So I think that, I think that there's always all of those things going on, and we see that in our moment now as well, where take, for example, the trans liberation movement. Within that, you have some people who are doubling down on a kind of essentialist rhetoric of, trans brains, or like men's brains, and how trans people have that and trapped in the wrong body kind of narratives. But then you also have the people who are more deconstructing the entire idea of a fixed gender identification. And I guess I think that all of us are speaking to different audiences. That's not a bad thing. I think that how we frame our politics is less important than the energy behind our politics. And so I am more than fine. In fact, I think it's good that we have so many different approaches to the articulation of identity within our politics. I think we need that in order to reach all the people that we need to reach and move things in a better direction.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I have one kind of final question before we kind of open it up to Q&A, and it's somewhat personal, and it picks up on, I think, the blurriness between a public-private distinction. But I just wanted to ask you both how you think about publicly and privately identifying in your own lives as you are scholars and as you are publishing in public and popular venues, and just how that works in your own professional practice. Yeah, and I think one answer to that is, well, we're here right now, and we're doing it, and and here we are, and we're talking about how these new, formulations of identity and how to be together in the room. And I mean, I certainly am coming away with new things to think and feel with, as I said, and so anyway, maybe I'm answering the question too, but.
I don't have a complete answer to your question, but I'll tell you one thing that I've been thinking about, which is the difference between hiding part of who I am and not showing part of who I am. Mm-hmm. I want to be an integrated person. I want to be someone who is the same person in every place that I go. That doesn't mean I want to show all the same parts of myself in every place that I go. And so I guess that's not an answer to your question, but that's the perpetual question that I'm asking myself and that I'm trying to navigate. And I'm also, I think, part of the question of identity, what some would call identity politics, but what I think of as just this attempt to make identities that are sites of recognition instead of alienation. Part of what I think is so important about that is that I think that movement or movements, collection of movements, is trying to make our institutions spaces where that kind of integrity is more possible. Mm-hmm. So the two really for me, they don't come apart. Like that question to myself about how I navigate these spaces and the question of what kind of political force do I want to be in the institutions that I am part of in order to make them more livable for not just me, but for all kinds of people who are marginalized along many dimensions and feel the need to hide parts of themselves in those institutions.
Yeah, I hear you, and I really appreciate this call for those of us who work at or matriculate at institutions to make them accountable to recognition and to recognizing. Yeah.
I would just say that, identities are names that can clarify as much as they can obfuscate, and and I'm sure we all have examples of the latter, in kind of our, to bring it to bring an entire biography or kind of set of lived experiences to every encounter might not be practical, but I think how you so I think about how intentional I am with kind of with kind of labels that I that I might use for myself or that others might use for me without me even saying anything. And kind of when do I need to, when do I need to make an intervention? But also thinking about what are the assumptions behind every time a particular kind of identity gets kind of deployed, and just trying to think about kind of the kind of the larger truths that people are trying to access or avoid in any kind of given situation.
Yeah, thank you. So yes, now we are ready to open to the floor, and I see there's a question. If you wouldn't mind migrating to that microphone, then that's how we will.
I think my question is for Dr. Dembrov and both of you. James Baldwin always a really calming personality for me when I read or when I hear his words. It is always something there like calming. But when you say that the minoritized or marginalized group try to understand the bullying part is another burden to we put on their shoulders, right? I mean, it is not enough for you to get harmed, but also you need to understand them. It is not you. Their own problems cause this bullying kind of thing. And I don't think it's fair. I mean, there is an anger, right? Because we have right to get angry about all the things we are suffering, you know. And saying that, just calm down, do not frustrate it or anything. If you understand them, you will solve the problem. I saw two problems here. One, we try to narrow the problem between interpersonal relations and ignoring the broader or systematic problem that causes that kind of problems, unlivable circumstances, creation of unlivable circumstances. So I think my question is, what if we say that you are right to be angry because they are jerks, and they do that because of the system, because this is how they are taught, you know, and you have right to get active against them. Mm-hmm. So where do you put activism, anger, and turning anger into something, a political action to change the system instead of understanding my terrible neighbor?
Yeah, no, thank you. So I think that Baldwin is not telling James not to be angry. Baldwin himself expresses a lot of anger. You know, he says, for example, in that quote I read, neither time nor history, neither I nor history will ever forgive them for the things that they're doing, right? So I don't think his advice is don't be angry. And his advice is certainly not don't do activism. He was very involved in activism, as were his close friends in his community. It was very much an activist community. I think what he's saying to James is not trying to put an extra burden on James, but is actually pointing out to James that without another understanding, without a clearer understanding of why white people treat him the way that they do, that will end up hurting James. He needs to have another interpretation of what's going on in order to have a sense of himself that is also not actively in like denial about so much of his experience. So I think going back to the point that like all the identities are relational, that if we try to just cut off, or we do worse, what he says in other writing, he talks about the dangers of doing the same thing, of demonizing white people because one is so upset about being degraded by white people, that you end up actually hurting yourself. He thinks that there is a deep spiritual and existential harm that we do to ourselves when we do that. So I understand, you know, and I don't know what it's like to be Black in America. I do know what it's like to be trans in America, and to be trans coming out of a very Republican, right-wing household area. I know how difficult it is to, and I'm still working on it, of getting to a place of accepting with love. But I also know that the more I work on doing that, the primary beneficiary of that work is me. And so I think that's what Baldwin is saying to James, not trying to just add on or increase the burden that is already there.
Thank you for two really great and inspiring talks. I guess I wanted to ask a question about the flip side of that coin, the social construction of traditionally powerful identities. It seems like as James trains himself to understand his own history and to understand white people as having a kind of flawed experience of their own identities. White people also end up experiencing, learning to see themselves the way Baldwin and James now see them. And you can say the same about, say, the cis gay members of the militant community in Sao Paulo, as I understand it. That's part of what I got from your interview comments, Professor Sosa. I wonder then where the middle ground or the compromise is between training these people to understand aspects of their identity solely from the other side in a way that seems to create resentment, guilt, and shut out the possibility of meaningful collaboration, versus encouraging them to retreat into those identities and say, no, I don't, I refuse your picture of me. To train white people or cis people to see themselves only as black people or trans people see them seems like a mirror image of the problem that we were trying to solve to begin with. But if we tell them not to see themselves that way at all, it seems like we're just teaching ignorance and the status quo.
Sure. Yeah. So I mean, I think your question also speaks to me also just even as an educator, right? And thinking about kind of like how do you take people like where they are, like the psychologist Beverly Tatum says that like when she worked with like white students as a black woman, she had trouble articulating like what it was to kind of what a dominant identity was, right? Like, and how to kind of express that until she tapped into her own heterosexuality. And she said, well, I can understand this dominant identity in order to talk to people with other dominant identities, right? And that is that's an act of empathy. It's also an act of it's an act of self-critique and an act of humility, right? Like like her kind of larger point is that that kind of we could all here living and residing in the the kind of richest nation on earth, like like even if we have different kind of citizenship relations to it, we can all understand in some way, okay, I have some type of privilege like relative to someone else, right? And that can be kind of a point of examination to understand what dominance is, irrespective of any kind of specific kind of relationship. So, I don't think it's about kind of telling, having people who have kind of dominant identities to say, you have to see the world as, you have to see yourself as the way that like people with marginalized identities like see you. I think it's, I don't know. I mean, I would almost say it's kind of more, like almost like do unto others kind of, situation, where, yeah, I mean, the kind of the abstract principle of kind of dominance and subordination is something that can be understood across kind of a vast array of settings. So, I mean, that's how I would kind of approach that, either kind of like activistly or like pedagogically or something.
Yeah, I'll just add one thing to that, especially to the last bit. I think that, especially thinking about what Baldwin is saying, but I'll just speak for myself about how I think about it. I don't think the urge, like I would not urge cis people, see yourself the way trans people see you. At least that's not the description I would give it. I think it's more going back to the theme of history, know the history. And when you know the history, you have a better understanding of yourself. I think most people don't know and don't want to know the history of sex classification, of the reinscription of gender roles through violent socialization. like these are histories that I think you don't need to see yourself through another person's lens. Once you look into the history gives you a lens on yourself. And I think that when we all learn the histories of how we came into these formations of relationship with each other, it makes it, I don't know, shame and guilt they seem like irrelevant at that point. That's not the thing. It's kind of like, well, we see now more clearly how we got here, and that gives us a better sense of how we can change it so that we can all be more fully ourselves because we don't need to be in relationships of denial with each other. So yeah, I just want to add the element of history to everything, but I agree with everything that Jay said.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Hello, wonderful people. Thank you so much for 2 wonderful talks and discussion, and 2 as well for moderating. So my question was related to in thinking about public and private identities. I was reminded of 2 seemingly contradictory realities. In terms of queer activism, in the ways ACT UP had very public demonstrations, the practice in which not explicitly announcing your either allyship or identity within the queer community was directly resulted in the deaths of thousands of queer people in the AIDS epidemic and the silence equals death rhetoric, or even Harvey Milk before the AIDS epidemic, who partook in outing people in the San Francisco community who were queer in order to show the sheer number of people involved in queer liberation in those movements. But I'm reminded that I would never partake in that practice myself, and that's actually incredibly damaging and involves in a lot of putting people up towards the proclivity to be victims of violence. And so what I guess I'm asking here is, it seems very clear that in a lot of situations, even beyond queer activism, such as solidarity with people who are facing the genocide in Gaza right now, silence or not speaking about your allyship in a certain group, while it might put your job or your social standing at risk, it does result in the death of thousands to millions of people, and how to navigate dealing with the fact that other people are going to remain silent, and might even feel the person needs to remain silent for less privileged. I mean, obviously I'm cisgender and homosexual, which is of all of the queer identities, not necessarily the most marginalized positioning to be in. But I guess I'm kind of asking for some steering on a framework of ways and engaging with people who do remain silent, and their silence is partaking in the legitimate death of thousands of people, and what maybe even providing ways of working with them and having love for them despite these clearly harmful practices. Does that make sense? That was not worded very well at all.
So first, to the specific pragmatic question of if someone says they're not willing to put their voice to a certain thing, what about their money? What about their, what about writing a letter? If it's about kind of practical solutions, thinking about the kind of they don't have to buy products. They don't have to, there are kind of multiple ways that we can be kind of political actors in this world. The question around silence was really interesting because this event was, kind of geared around publicity versus privacy. And what you're making me realize is that publicity has many others, right? Privacy is one, right? And kind of queer, the kind of right to privacy was actually part of the kind of the ways in which kind of homosexual liberation in the 1950s was originally conceived, right? The bedroom as a private space for white gay men and lesbians. Secrecy is another other of publicity, and another one that we might throw out there is what the philosopher Edward Glissant calls opacity, right? The kind of the fact that we're not owed everyone's story. Some stories are can remain kind of where they are kind of protected. So I think it might be thinking about their kind of that there are kind of different reasons for kind of when someone is not public might be one way to start to think about, you know, what is going on, diagnosing any particular situation.
Yeah, I'll keep my remarks brief. I think that, and again, in addition, I agree that everything you said, taking a slightly different angle on it. Specifically speaking to the situation where the silence of others is infuriating or depressing, because you know that the silence is coming from fear, or what in a less charitable tone one might call cowardice. I know that it's really tempting and sometimes momentarily gratifying to express anger at those people or to alienate oneself from them. But I do think that if the goal is being effective, that just makes people dig in deeper. It makes them more afraid. It ends up actually acting against the thing that you want. I think that it is really helpful, though, to model what integrity looks like and to be curious about their silence when speaking with them. Try to figure out why they are silent and get through questioning, get them to reflect on their own silence. And it doesn't mean that they're going to speak, but I do think in terms of strategy, because, you know, I'm at an institution where a lot of people are being silent right now about Gaza because they're afraid of what might happen to them if they speak. And it's hard to not feel like you're going like nuts, that like your perspective on reality is so different than other people's. You're like, how do we speak? And I think curiosity has to be the thing that allows us to talk to each other, because otherwise we just end up polarized and alienated from each other, and then we both just dig in deeper. Thank you.
Thank you both so much for those answers. And I think we have time for one more question.
Maybe could we just hear?
Oh, yeah, let's hear all the questions.
Yeah.
That's better. Much better. Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
I'll try to keep it brief, but I guess I mostly had a question for Robin about your part of the talk where you kind of give this mechanism that explains like how identities are formed, drawing on Baldwin. So there's this process of self-interpretation that you talk about, which I took to be a way of kind of seeing yourself based on how you interpret how others see you. It's a little bit wordy, but that was kind of what I thought the idea was. But one question I had about this kind of account was like, how can it make sense of cases where, let's say that you're gay or trans, but like you don't really know if others really see you this way or treat you this way, or even if you know that they don't see you this way, like you still really have this identity as like a deep-rooted part of yourself. So I guess, yeah, that was kind of my question, is like how through this mechanism can we make sense of these cases where our own identities come apart from how, like, I guess, we socially interact with others and are perceived by them.
Thank you.
Sorry.
And we will take the next two as well. Thank you.
So my question, by the way, hi. My question was, I was kind of thinking of the self-identification versus social constructive or social identification. Is there a scenario that we will need to depend on social identification rather than the self? Because I was just thinking, if a person was in a coma from a young age, we don't know that person has the right to be like fit in a gender, but we don't know because they can't speak with us. So is there a way, depending on the way they their appearance, if they're a man or a female, like their appearance, like we categorize them on their appearance, or we still like have to consider what they would self-identify? I'm sorry, my question's like super weird, but yeah, that basically my question is how we should approach theorizing gender identification if the person does not have the ability to self-identify.
Okay.
Hi, I have questions about how does our knowledge of our identity and the other person's identity inform us in our interaction with them. I have a quick example. I come from the art department. A lot of lefties, a lot of liberal queer kids. We have this one elderly citizen in my art class. They are 60 years old, they're white, cis, and straight, and they're hard of hearing. So in this case, we know he's elder, so he may have more experience, and generally in the society, he may have more power than a lot of us. But in this localized, small environment, we become the minority surrounding this individual, and I sometimes, I didn't do anything bad, but I feel like I could have done something more considerate because I forgot the fact that in this localized environment, I may be the one in a lot of standard having more power over them. I guess that makes me think, what do we do when we are the one having more power? Or in a more messy situation, say age, they're older, so maybe there's a power dynamic make them more advantage, but also I have more time to live and I have more energy. This may be an advantage on my side too. So what does these information after we know them, like after we have them, okay, we understand this is very complex, then what do we do about it? Like, to me, it gives me hesitance toward approaching situations. And maybe that could form a kind of patience that opens the curiosity and conversation, and maybe it leads to nonviolence. But I wonder if you guys think about it, and like, is there more to it?
Yeah. Thank you. All right, so you respond, I think, in general to whatever you would like. Yeah.
Okay, so I'll say something really that maybe touches on all three, but especially the first one, which is that. So the way I think of identity here is that we have lenses for interpretation, and those lenses we use for both interpreting ourselves, interpreting other people, and those lenses are also used by institutions. So we have self-identification, we have other identification, we have institutional identification. All of those lenses are social in the sense that there isn't a private language a la Wittgenstein, right? Like, we learn meaning through other people. Now, that doesn't need to be your immediate environment. I mean, even the fact of self-identifying as gay means that you have access to that word gay and you have some sense of what it means. Like, you're still drawing on a history of other people and some kind of community of other people. So I think that, and that's always, and it's dynamic, right? The ways that we create meaning are always changing, and when we get a word, we use it, and as we all use words, we all contribute to their meaning. So that's just to say there's a lot of space for movement between identities, and I'm not saying that your self-identity needs to reflect the identity that's conferred onto you or the lens through which other people see you in your immediate environment. It's just to make the point that none of us have identity in a vacuum.
I'll just briefly say to the third person, I think you answered your question, I congratulate you on that. But also that means that, you know, that kind of that process of like that self and other evaluation is always going to feel provisional, uncomfortable. We're not going to get it right. We might not know what to do with the moment. Sometimes we have to let moments pass because like to correct them makes it about us and not about the things that we've done. And sometimes we have to go back and we have to do that, you know? So if you're feeling uncomfortable, you're doing the right thing.
Yeah, I think that is a wonderful note to end on. So could we please thank our speakers? Yeah.